Welcome to Module 5 of Platoon's Intro to Coding self-paced program. So far, you've learned how to build programs using variables, conditionals, loops, lists, and dictionaries. But by now, you might have noticed something, that your code is getting longer and a little harder to manage. That's where functions come in. In this video, we're going to explain what functions are, why they're important, and how they'll make your programs cleaner, easier to read, and easier to fix. What is a function? A function is a block of code that you can define once and reuse whenever you need it. It performs a specific task. Now, why do we use functions? Well, functions allow us to adhere to an unspoken rule that we software engineers like to live by, which is the DRY rule. DRY is an acronym that is short for Don't Repeat Yourself. This helps you organize your code into logical chunks. It helps you avoid repeating yourself, making your code easier to read, test, and fix. And it helps you work better on bigger projects with other people. I want you to think of a function like a coffee machine. You press the button and it runs a set of steps to brew coffee. You don't have to think about the steps every time. You just use the machine. Whether you want your coffee to be cold or hot, the size of your cup, or the type of coffee that you want to make, all this is already pre-built into the coffee machine, and you don't have to worry about how it works. You just press the button. Now let's talk about how we can define a function using Python. In Python, to create a brand new function, we want to use the def keyword, which is short for define. This tells Python that we are ready to create a custom function. A function requires a name, just like a variable. The function should have a name that's relevant to the functionality of the function itself or what it is supposed to be doing. Because this function is going to be a very simple one, all I want to do is create a greeting function. I'm going to call it greet. After you pass in the name of the function, you want to follow it up with open and close parentheses. The functions have the ability to take in additional information. This information, when created within the definition of your function, is called a parameter. These parameters could be anything you desire. Because this greeting is taking no extra information, I just want to give a simple print statement of hello, welcome to Platoon. I'm not going to pass in anything within this parentheses because it doesn't need any additional information. So I'll leave it blank. And then I'm going to end this line with a colon, letting Python know that I am ready to add the code logic to my function. I press enter and I go to the next line and it is automatically indented to the right. For the functionality of here, I'm going to add a print statement that says hello, welcome to Platoon. This greeting would just basically just give a basic greeting to our user within our output. Once I'm done, I press enter again, and I can unindent by using my backspace to let Python know that I am ready to continue with the rest of my code. When I'm ready to use this function, to call and utilize the function, I'm going to use the name of the function with the open and close parentheses. If my function required any kind of additional information, this is the moment where I would pass it in within my parentheses. But because this function doesn't require any additional information, the parentheses is going to stay empty. So all I need to run this is just the name of the function and the parentheses. When I press run, I see here that I get my greeting within my output box. I didn't have to recreate this print statement. Now this comes in handy, especially if I had multiple people to greet. If this function was a little bit more deliberate, there was more information to this, if I had to say multiple print statements here within a function, it would be very tedious if I had to say the same script or the same lines to multiple people at a time. It becomes easier when everything is nested within a function, and instead of typing out this long line, all I have to type out is the name of the function. When I run this, I see that I get my print statement for every single time that I call the greet function. Now, one thing that I want you to pay attention to is the fact that every single time that I call this function, it needs the parentheses, even though it's not taking any parameters. When I remove the parentheses, I see here that one of the print statements is no longer being presented. That's because that last greeting function is not being registered as a function because it's not being ended with the parentheses. So once again, even though you don't have any parameters set within the definition of your function, you still require the parentheses when calling the function. To wrap this up, we use the def keyword to define a function. The parentheses are there, so in case we want to add parameters. We have the logic of the function itself. And then we call the function simply by writing its name with the parentheses. Now, what if we did want to pass in some kind of additional information? Let's go ahead and update our function to a much more advanced version of it. Instead of just greet, let's use greet user. Here, I want to specifically greet a specific person by their name. Because I'm trying to use their name, I'm going to pass in this information as additional information within the parentheses. When you pass in a parameter, you want to give it a relevant name like you did your function or like you would create a variable. It makes sense that because I'm trying to greet a specific person, I should probably pass in the name of the person I'm trying to greet within my parentheses. Within the logic of my function, I'm going to add a print statement. And I'm going to use a formatted string where I can pass in that parameter as values within curly braces. Now, when I'm ready to use this function, I can say greet user, and I can pass in the name of the people that I am trying to greet. When I run this, I see that my print statement is customizable to each individual name that I pass in. Because this function did have a parameter set within the definition of my function, when I go to use it, I need to pass in that information. My function is relying on it and it is expecting it. One thing that I want to specify here is the terminology for these parameters. When creating a function, or essentially when you're defining it, this is called a parameter. But when you're actually calling the function and using it in real time, the naming convention for this now becomes an argument. So when defining the function, these are parameters. When actually using the function, it's called an argument. These names are usually used interchangeably. The only difference is when they're being used. Parameters is used when defining it. An argument is used when calling the function. But now we can greet different users by passing different names into the function. Name is a parameter, a piece of information the function needs to do its job. When we call it, we pass in the argument that's supposed to take place into that parameter's spot, and it uses that within our formatted string to give us that formatted greeting. Now let's talk about functions that return values. What happens if I wanted to create a function that adds different numbers together? Let's go ahead and create a new function called add. And I'm going to pass in two arguments, because when you add something, you essentially want to add two different things together. So I'm going to go pass in a, and to add an additional parameter here, I'm going to add a comma to space it out. And then I can pass in a second parameter here called b. Within my code logic, I want to say print a plus b. Now let's see how this works. I'm going to go ahead and call the function of add, and I'm going to pass in 2 and 5. Just like when I created the parameters, when I call the function, I have to pass in the two arguments that are supposed to take place of those parameters, separated by the comma. When I run this, I see that I get the value of 7. But what happens if I want my code to do some form of math and save it into a variable? Let's say final result is equal to the function result of add. Well, when I run this, I still get 7. But what happens if I try to print out final results? When this runs, line 4 should run the function of add. Add by default will print out the result of 2 plus 5. And I'm saving that to the variable called final result. So when I print that variable out, I would think I should see 7 pop up twice. Because it's being printed out when I run add, and it's being printed out on line 5. But when I run this, line 5 prints out none. Why is that? Well, what's happening here is that the function by default doesn't return anything. It quite literally returns a value of none. Although it's still printing out A and B added together, there's nothing that's being returned when this function runs. So when function of add runs on line 4, it's going to return none and save it into final result. So when I print final result, I see that none is being presented. So how do I fix that? How do I make it so my function can actually pass the information back to a variable? Well, that's when we use the return statement. We return A plus B. This allows the function to return something back to the global or the outside scope away from the function. Everything within this function is what we like to call local scope. It is locally happening within my function, but it's not actually happening within the outside or what we call the global scope of my code. So although A plus B is happening, nothing comes back from the local scope. It stays within my function. Whatever happened in my function stayed within my function. And the rest of my code or my global scope doesn't have the ability to access it. So if I want to use it, I need to return these values back to the global scope or the outside of my code so the rest of my code can use it. And when I run this, I see that now when I print final result, I also get 7. The return statement sends a value back to where the function was called. This makes your functions much more flexible. They don't just do things, but they calculate and return results to you. I want you to think about your function almost like a kitchen. If you go to the kitchen and make yourself a cake or a sandwich or a bowl of cereal, if you don't bring it out of the kitchen, can you really eat it? Are you able to eat it in your kitchen or your diner? Can you go and lay down on the sofa and watch TV and eat your sandwich? Not if you don't bring it out of the kitchen. It might exist in the kitchen, but it does not mean that you have access to it in other rooms of your house. So with that same logic, whenever creating something within my function, I need to make sure that I return it back out of my function to the rest of my code so I can use it. Functions are the foundation of bigger programs and professional software development. Without functions, your code gets long, repetitive, and hard to manage. With functions, you can break your program into small, manageable pieces. You can test them individually, reuse them in different parts of your program, and make changes without breaking everything. To recap, you learn what functions are, how to define them, how to pass parameters, and how to return values. In the next video, we're going to write out our very first function together, building something small, simple, and useful. Functions are a big step forward writing professional, real-world code. Don't worry if it feels a little new at first, you'll get the hang of it. Get ready, next we'll start writing your first reusable functions.